I'd like to introduce Rob Hawley. It's Hawley. Hawley. I always say it wrong. Rob owns Taos Herb Company, which I'm sure a lot of you know about, and he is going to talk to us about medicinal wild plants. And I'll let you continue introducing yourself. Thank you, Rob.
Thank you. Do you need these notes? I'll probably get smudges on them. Here's my thing. Well, yep, so I'm Rob Hawley, and my sister and I own the Taos Herb Company and started it about 35 years ago. And we make our living with plants. And we manufacture a lot of herbal medicines out of plants and sell them to other stores and sell them locally. And so I'm a big fan of plants. And I'm a big fan of being out with the plants, outdoors, in the mountains especially, but anywhere where there's plants. And so this is the Native Plant Society, and so some of the plants that we're going to see here are, I don't know if they're exactly going to be considered invasive species, but they're certainly not natives, but they have interesting histories, how they arrived here, some of them. Couple of thank yous. Native Plant Society of Taos, thanks for dinner. They bought me enchiladas at Quad South. And thanks to Francis for digitizing my slides. I've been showing these slides with Carousel for the past 25 years, and he zoomed them off and put them into the world of computers. So that's pretty cool. So I feel really uptown. So some of you, perhaps not everybody, I don't know, I'm not going to count, but I only made 30 copies of my little sheet on simple principles of herbal medicine. I'd like to blame the misspelling of principle on spell check, but that was my error. So, you know, medicinal plants, of course, are the source of really most of our medicine, at least historically. You know, today we're able to synthesize analogs to natural compounds and purify things to the point where they don't really resemble plants, but plants really are the origin of most of our medicine. Interesting thing to know that the word drug actually comes from a Middle Dutch word, droog, which means bundle of dried plants. And in all the old materia medicas, you know, plants are referred to as, you know, crude drug Cascara sagrada, crude drug echinacea, crude drug opium. So that means that plants really have extremely complicated things to talk about when it comes to them as medicine. They're all over the place. There's a lot of science there. What I like to do for the purposes of this kind of lecture is distill it down to some simple principles. And when you understand these simple principles of herbal medicine, you only need to know a few plants and you have a rather extensive pharmacy at your disposal for treating all kinds of things when you just understand these few simple principles. Had another thought, but it just slipped out of my brain. Dang, it was a really important thought. Yeah, it'll come back, I hope. So at any rate, we'll begin with, I think, what do we have at the top of the list, sir? Bitters. So I'm going to be kind of all over the place in this. First of all, we're going to look at sagebrush, which is Artemisia tridentata in the aster family, of course. And sagebrush has a variety of different medicinal properties. And the first thing, if you actually taste it, it's very bitter. And bitter is one of those tastes that I find 90% of the people I talk to have no idea what bitter is. They mean, oh, you mean like lemons, right? Like vinegar, right? Yeah, that's bitter, right? Like, well, no, that's not bitter. And so bitter is one of the basic tastes that we taste on our tongue. And here in the United States, we tend to avoid it. But, you know, if you go to Europe, many of the tables in restaurants in Italy and France and Spain and Germany will have a bottle of bitters there on the table. And people shake it into their water and they sit around and sip it before the meal because we believe it's good for our appetite. So the reason this is because the taste of bitter on the tongue, stimulate is too strong a word, but it innervates the vagus nerve, which tends to enable what we call parasympathetic response. And the parasympathetic nervous system is what causes salivation, digestive enzyme production, peristalsis. Is that me doing that? Peristalsis, which pushes food through the body, perspiration also. So one of the things that we deal a lot with in our culture is indigestion. I mean, if 5 of your friends out of 6 of your friends aren't on ion pump inhibitors like Prilosec or some other drug for heartburn, then I would be surprised. It's a huge thing. And one of the reasons in herbal medicine we believe that's true is because we live in a very stressful society, and that when we are under stress, we stimulate adrenaline, and adrenaline blocks the digestive process. Adrenaline is what's called the sympathetic agonist, and it limits parasympathetic response. So our mouths dry up, we lose our appetite. Food goes into the stomach, we eat, but it won't empty out of the stomach because the presence of adrenaline interferes with the stomach emptying properly. So sipping a bitter before a meal is a way of doing little energetic push-ups for your parasympathetic nervous system and stimulating digestive response. And we call it a bitter tonic, and this is one of the words that we like to use in herbal medicine that isn't so much used in modern Western medicine. But a tonic is something that isn't so drug-like. What it does is if you use it on a regular basis, it tends to enhance function. So a really good example of a tonic is exercise. You know, if you did a push-up once back in 2004, probably didn't do you much good, but if you did 20 push-ups every day since 2004, you'll be stronger, you may sleep better, your blood pressure may be lower, you will probably live longer. So tonic is a very real and important thing that we talk about in herbal medicine, but it's, when you talk to doctors, they often look at me like I don't know what I'm talking about when I use words like that. So what we do with a bitter, like chamiso, sagebrush, and we call this plant in Spanish, we call it chamiso, which is actually a Spanish word that means kindling. So lots of plants in the Spanish language, depending upon where you are chamisos or chamizos, and it means they've got woody little sticks you can start fires with. But here around Taos, we call this chamiso pardo, or gray chamiso. So chamiso, sagebrush, Artemisia tridentata, if you make a tea of it and you sip little sips before your meal, every time you taste that little bitter taste, you get a little bit of parasympathetic letdown and a little enhancement of the digestive process. And if you do this before every meal, you can actually strengthen your digestion overall in a pretty significant way. And it's also interesting, you know, I mean, I'm a fan of all medicine, Western medicine too. I'm very pragmatic. I think you use what works where it's appropriate. And so drugs that inhibit the production of hydrochloric acid are really great for that period of time where you want to try and heal the esophagus because the reflux is irritating the tissue in the esophagus. But if you continue to inhibit the production of hydrochloric acid, it interferes with the stomach's willingness to let go of the food and pass it into the intestine, because part of that is pH related. So if you don't produce enough acid, you tend to hang on to the food, which means the stomach overfills and it tends to come back up the esophagus more readily. So those drugs that are used to treat it in some way can actually make the problem worse. So good things to take for a while until you get over the acute irritation, but you don't want to take them all the time. So bitters are something that are great for people who've been barfing for a while and have trouble developing their appetite, people who've been on IV fluids and are just not hungry. Anybody who's having trouble developing an appetite or having trouble digesting, because the bitters also tend to help improve the volume and spectrum of pancreatic enzymes. So that's one of the things that sagebrush does. It's a bitter. Sagebrush is also an aromatic. It has what we call volatile oils in it, and volatile oils are, you're all familiar with it, it's how peppermint smells, it's how oregano smells, it's these smelly, easily excited substances in plants that we call oils, but they're not really oils, they're more like solvents of oils. Oils are really things like butter and olive oil, they're lipids, they're fats, and these things are more like hydrocarbons and terpenes and esters and alcohols and things like that. They're solvents of oils. And the reason I point that out is because when you consume a tea that has volatile oils in it, like sagebrush, like chamiso pardo, your body can't break down these volatile compounds the way it can lipids, the way it can do butter or olive oil. And it can use those things calorically. These things can't really be broken down. So what happens is they pass through the bowel wall, they go into the bloodstream, and the body says, what is this stuff? We got to get rid of it. And so as the body's trying to get rid of it, it enhances what we call diaphoresis, and it makes us perspire more. So in the old days, one of the ways we would lower fevers is by giving people big, strong cups of peppermint tea, and it would get them sweating, and that evaporative cooling would lower fever. But a more useful thing about volatile oils is that that same principle, those volatile oils are brought through the surface of the lungs and escorted by moisture from the bloodstream, and that moistens the surface, the interior surface of the lungs, and we call this an expectorant, right? So here in New Mexico, one of our big problems is that when people end up with respiratory illnesses, the lungs become inflamed, and the response is to produce more mucus, but every time we exhale, if you've ever breathed on a mirror or a piece of glass, you see that you lose moisture from your breath every time you exhale. So this increased mucus production becomes dehydrated. So you get more and more mucus, more of that mucoprotein, but it tends to become thick and sticky. And so when you try to cough, you have to cough really energetically to get that mucus to move. And that coughing, if it's really energetic and rigorous, can actually bruise the lungs and cause bronchitis and increase the inflammation in the lungs. So you want what we call a functional cough. You want to be able to cough once or twice and move the goop out of your lungs, and that moves bacterial colonies that may be growing in the mucus. It helps, the thin mucus helps soothe the lungs better than thick, sticky mucus, and you help prevent somebody from developing further inflammation through energetic coughing. So the volatile principle, although volatile oils in plants have manifold effects as medicine, one of the common things that a lot of volatile oils do is cause an increase in perspiration, an increase in moisture content in the lungs. So the volatile principle is partly that. The other thing that volatile oils do is many of them tend to soothe and relax the intestine wall, so they tend to relax intestinal cramping. Also, the presence of volatile oils circulating in the bloodstream when they enter the blood vessels of the uterus, throughout the bloodstream, they tend to interfere with oxygen transfer from hemoglobin to cell. So if you drink a lot of really strong peppermint tea, you get to be kind of dizzy because you're getting a little oxygen deprived because of the presence of the peppermint oil in your bloodstream. So what the uterus does to protect itself is it constricts the blood vessels in the uterus, and since it's a muscle that has lots of blood vessels, the uterus itself constricts because of the presence of volatile oils like those in sagebrush. And the reason that's useful is because in the case of a menstrual cramp, which is a dysfunctional spasm, it'll help contract the uterus beyond the spasm and alleviate the cramping. It'll also, for women who have a tardy or late menstrual cycle, because it helps the uterus contract a little bit, it helps begin the menstrual flow. So it helps both alleviate cramping and begins the menses. There's some other interesting things. We call this genus, the Artemisias, the common name for them is the wormwoods, and that's because they contain a couple of interesting compounds. One is artemisinin, and artemisinin is irritating to a number of parasites that inhabit the intestines, the cysts of roundworms and threadworms, pinworms, these kinds of small parasites. And so it doesn't kill them. It's not like a parasiticide, but they want to get away from it, and it can be part of an effective way to deworm the intestine of small parasites. Now, it doesn't work against big, durable parasites like liver flukes and tapeworms and these guys, but for small roundworms, it works pretty effectively. And interestingly enough, too, sagebrush, like many of the other artemisias, contains a substance called not artemisin, but artemisinin. And artemisinin is used in India and China as an anti-malarial drug, but in the past few years we've discovered that it has some pretty interesting anti-cancer properties. It tends to bind at what are called the ferritin receptor sites, the iron, where iron is recognized on cells, and interferes with the ability of a cancer cell to replicate itself because it doesn't have access to enough iron. And, of course, people make smudge sticks out of it, too, so a little bit of the spirit medicine about sage. So, of course, there's all these plants that people call sage, none of, or a few of which are actually sage. And for you that are interested in plants, you'll know that real sage is in the plant family of Laminaceae, the same family as peppermint and spearmint and oregano and those fellows. And it's in the genus of Salvia. But I don't know if you'd even call them amateur botanists, but people who didn't know what they were talking about, because these plants are gray-green and aromatic the way garden sage is, they gave all of these artemisias sage names, or most of them have, there's silver sage, and there's sacred sage, and there's buffalo sage, and there's, but they're not sages. But we call them that. So sage as a spirit plant for a lot of indigenous cultures here is considered to be a protector spirit and a healing spirit. And that's a really important part. I remembered what I was going to say now. One of the things that's really fascinating about herbal medicine is not only does it have really functional medicine in it, but it plays an incredibly important part in belief systems in cultures. So you find a lot of plants which don't have really very remarkable pharmacologic value, but they're woven deeply into familial systems of plant use as medicine and into spiritual and religious uses of plant medicine. And it makes herbalism have that other very different kind of non-science aspect, which is really very important. Because personally what I believe is what you believe is your medicine. The things that we carry around as our truth are very important to us, and we even though we might be wrong by the opinion of other people, we might just stick with it and die with those ideas, and they were important to us all our lives. So the things we believe are important, and they're part of our medicine also. So let's see, So this is Artemisia tridentata, and it's called tridentata because the leaves have these three little teeth or three little lobes on them. Here's another picture of it that's beginning to go into bloom. Pardon my amateur photography. I'm not that good at it, but these aren't too bad. Another aromatic plant, and one of our most important local medicinal plants, very special plant, Osha de la Sierra. It's in the Apiaceae family. Its genus and species is Ligusticum porteri. It's also called Porter's lovage or Colorado cough root. And its best name locally, though, is Osha de la Sierra. That's Osha of the mountains. And nobody really knows what Osha means or where it came from exactly, or nobody that I've ever met. But it's interesting to know that for many of the Plains Indians people, this is considered to be bear medicine or bear root. And there's a really interesting man that lives up in Steamboat Springs, Colorado, named Sean Sigstead, and he did his PhD thesis on the use of plants as medicine by animals. And he did a lot of filming in the forest with, heat-triggered cameras and stuff of bears digging up Osha in the spring. And they dig it up and they chew it up and they rub it all over their faces. And he was able to throw chunks of Osha root into bears in zoos too and document that. It's really quite interesting. So interestingly enough, the Spanish word, of course, for bear is oso or osa for a female bear, and Osha is very similar to that. We don't know if that's where it came from, but I like to think so. So Osha de la Sierra as a medicine, it's primarily because of its volatile oils, although it has some other principles. It has an anesthetic property, so making tea of the root or chewing the root is very effective at numbing and soothing a sore throat. It also tends to stimulate thin secretions in the throat. It's a pretty effective expectorant. A side note about using volatile oils as expectorants is that if you are not well hydrated, they don't work very well. And that's a common condition of people that are febrile, that are feverish, is they've been sweating a lot. Sometimes your kidneys tend to become a little more active when you're febrile, and so you pee more. And it's really easy to be underhydrated when you have an infection and a fever. So if you're finding that Osha or chamiso pardo are not working well as expectorants for you, you might need to drink more water if you have a fever. And of course, it does those other things too. It tends to be a useful menstrual stimulant and alleviator of menstrual cramping. Osha is a high mountain plant. The seeds do not tolerate being consumed by birds like the way chili pepper seeds, and a lot of chili pepper seeds are spread by birds, bombing them off, pooping them out all over the place, and it spreads them. And Osha seeds don't do that, and Osha won't actually germinate and survive below about 8,000 feet. So whatever seeds it produces and wash down, whatever ones might germinate, they don't survive below 8,000 feet. They don't very effectively get into the next canyons when birds eat their seeds. Certainly the pollen is probably carried by pollinators to some degree, but it's thought that each little stand of Osha that you might find up in the mountains, and it grows primarily on moist northern faces. You'll find a few plants other places, but that's what it really likes. But each little stand is genetically isolated in its own little genetic tribe. So it's one of those plants that is much more easily damaged. Its genome is much more easily damaged by taking too much from one area. And this is a really hard thing to talk to people about, because people are always of the opinion like, oh, no, there's like lots of it. There's lots of it there. But people don't realize that it's much easier to damage and take away too much of the genetic material with Osha than it is with a lot of other plants that spread themselves around more easily. Any questions? Okay. Picture of the Osha root. It's primarily the root we use, but the leaves can be used as food. The seeds are used as food too. And the root is mostly used dry. We make a cough syrup out of it over at Taos Herb Company, as well as extracts and things. Another aromatic plant, this is Monarda fistulosa, or around here we call it Oregano de la Sierra. Back east they might call it bergamot mint, although here it has a distinct oregano-like smell and taste, and back east it has that more fruity aroma that gives it its name bergamot mint. So it's a variety of that plant. And so this is just another aromatic plant, and I'm not going to go too much into depth with it. It's pretty. People like to pick the flowers and stick them in honey to give their honey a little spice. Darn, that's a good picture. That's one of my few really good ones. This is a little plant not a lot of people know. It's called Moldavian Balm, Dracocephalum moldawca. And I don't know if I'm going in and out of this mic or the volume's going up and down on its own. This is a really cool little plant, and it's an aromatic. It's in the Laminaceae family, like the mints are. It's not really especially medicinal, but it's fun to find. So, another picture of the Moldavian balm. And of course, so now we come to the geraniums. This is Cranesbill, and of course it's called that. I don't know if my next picture has a very good picture of the Cranesbill. I don't seem to have a really good photo of that. But so the Cranesbills are called that because the seed pod looks like the bill of a crane, you know? And what these plants are useful as medicine primarily is as astringents. And so an astringent is something that binds proteins. So if you've ever drunk lemonade, you're familiar with the effect of an astringent. The acid in the lemon makes your mouth feel rough. And that's because acids, most acids are astringents. What they do is they bind up the mucoproteins, the mucus that lines the inside of our mouth, which you feel the inside of your mouth right now, it feels all slippery, unless you've got like a lemon in your mouth or something. And so astringents bind and denature proteins, and that makes them broadly useful as medicines. Astringents come in everything from very mild, very weakly binding astringents to very powerful, very rapidly binding astringents. So Cranesbill root is a pretty strong astringent. It's just not the strongest. It's not as strong as, say, oak bark, but it's a pretty strong astringent. So some place that you might use it would be for make a tea for a sore throat. It can be used in salves for hemorrhoids or in baths for postpartum inflammation to help heal episiotomy and take down the swelling. This is not a geranium story, this is an oak bark story, but I'll tell you a little story. When my youngest daughter was about 4, we went up to a hot springs in the San Luis Valley in Colorado, and we let her get sunburned floating around in the hot springs during the day. And so we didn't really have we didn't bring anything for it, so there's Quercus gambili, scrub oak there, and what I did is took a bunch of oak twigs and boiled them up in a pot and then dipped a rag in them and put them on her burns, and it turned them brown by morning. Took down the inflammation because of the astringency. This is not a great thing for your skin because this is actually how we tan hides, is with astringents. So if you know, if there's any vegans or vegetarians here, just bear with me here. But you know, if you cut an animal's skin off, it's going to rot and deteriorate. But if you change the nature of the protein in that animal's skin by applying a strong astringent like oak bark tea and rub it in, then you denature those proteins, and they are then largely unavailable to bacteria for consumption, and you end up with leather rather than flesh that goes back into the soil. So that's an example of a very powerful astringent and its effect. And so we might use a strong astringent like Cranesbill root for something where we really need to tighten stuff up, like in diarrhea. We would use an astringent like Cranesbill. But we might use a very gentle astringent like that from rose petals for an inflamed eye. So there's so many applications: sunburn, as douches, for hemorrhoids, for diarrhea, for sore throat. There's just lots of different applications of astringents. You could probably tan hides with Cranesbill, but it's not quite strong enough to make it the herb of choice. But it was one of those herbs that was commonly used by travelers, you know, when you had your pack animals with not well thought out loads that rubbed wrong, and you'd end up with blisters and raw spots on your horses or donkeys. At the end of the day, you could dig some of this up and put a poultice on there, and it would, it actually closes the sore overnight. I mean, it's also going to tend to make a nasty scar, because when something heals without being astringed like that, it heals better, because you denature the tissue and you interfere with its ability to replicate normal cells as well. So you get a bigger scar. But, if you're on the road and you need to get donkey going the next day, it works pretty well. I actually had an experience. Some buddies of mine used to go for these night hikes, and we'd gone up Taos Canyon. We were up high up there, and one of the guys brought his dog, and we started out before sunset, but we'd hiked a ways, and we stopped on the trail, and we're all getting sprayed with blood. And we're like, there's like this spray. When the dog had jumped over a log or something, but it had a bit through his tongue and punctured an artery, and it was squirting blood 6 or 8 feet out. And there was some geranium there, so I just dug it up and shaved it off with my knife and chewed up the root a little bit and held it on the dog's tongue. And the nature of an astringent coagulates blood pretty rapidly. So it stopped the bleeding within 30 seconds. Of course, it wouldn't be good first aid for, like a femoral artery bleed or something, but, yeah. And of course, that's the function of styptic pencils that we used to use when our razors weren't as good, or we were younger and didn't know how to shave or something.
Is it the root?
It is the root that is the most astringent part, but the whole plant is astringent. Another geranium. This one is Sagebrush. The previous one was Richardsoni. And rose, another astringent, Rosa woodseye. And around here we call this Rosa de Castillo, or rose of the castle. Potentilla, these are all rose family plants, and many of the rose family plants are astringents, and this one is Potentilla cinquefoil, or that's the other common name for it, and these are moderately strong astringents, not as strong as something like Cranesbill, but stronger than just rose petals. And there's a shrub potentilla. There's a couple of species that might be there. And the potentillas, they interbreed, and they're hard to tell one apart from another. There's lots of them, and the leaf shape are all over the place, and it's hard to figure them out. Mullein. Okay, so we're going to, with the exception of the root of mullein, which is a pretty effective astringent and is a traditional remedy used here in New Mexico by the parteras, the traditional midwives, for postpartum incontinence. Oh, I missed a whole thing about astringents there with the urinary tract. Let me back up a little bit. The other place that astringents are very useful is for those that you drink as tea and are absorbed through the bowel wall and then are excreted into the kidneys with their astringency intact. They become pretty effective for inflammation in the kidneys, bladder, ureters, and urethra. So they tend to shrink swelling and inflammation there. In addition to that, because bacteria are little single-celled organisms with protein coats on them, when you astringe those bacteria, you tend to do the same thing that lemonade does to the mucus in the mouth. It blobs them up, gathers them up as a little blob, and you pee them out as a microscopic lump, and you've just lowered the bacterial count in your bladder by drinking an astringent tea. This is part of the principle behind using cranberry juice. But some of the herbs we like to use for urinary tract are things like uva ursi and nettles. So I missed that little bit of astringency. But so the root of mullein is an astringent, and it can be used the way you'd use any astringent. And it's probably about as astringent as Cranesbill root, so it's a moderately strong astringent, but its traditional use is for postpartum incontinence. You know, after baby's been in your belly for 9 months, beating up your bladder, and women will often dribble urine after having a baby if they giggle or sneeze or cough. And so an astringent tea helps tone what's called the trigon sphincter, the little three-flapped muscle at the bottom of the bladder that's supposed to hold the urine back, and only when the urine begins to sneak through is a little nerve tell our brain that we actually have to pee. But if that muscle is weak, the urine slips past without the appropriate notice. Right. So mullein is interesting. A number of books classify it as a biennial, which of course is one of those plants that's programmed to come up the first year and foliate, and then the second year it produces a flower stalk and seeds, and then it dies. But I've actually seen individual mulleins that have grown 3 or 4 years before they have a chance to flower. Mulleins that are on the north side of a rock and they don't get enough light and it doesn't stay warm enough. So unlike some plants that are hard and fast biennials, mullein is not always a biennial. The leaves also are smoked in traditional Native American pipe mixtures for sacred ceremonies. It's not intoxicating or anything. It's actually one of the reasons it's used is because true tobacco is a plant that's highly sought after, the wild tobacco, and there's never enough of it. And it's also a pretty potent drug. I mean, wild tobacco is easily 4 or 5 times as potent with nicotine and other drugs than commercial tobacco is. So not easy to smoke straight wild tobacco. So it's usually extended with other things. But the leaves, and especially the flowers of mullein, have a resin in them that is anti-inflammatory. So drinking a tea of especially mullein flowers, and to a lesser degree mullein leaves, has an anti-inflammatory effect throughout the body, but its effect seems to be most marked in the lungs. So drinking mullein tea, especially mullein flower tea, is useful for reducing inflammation in the lungs. And we also make an oil out of the, I'm going to quit crouching and put this up here a little bit. Make an oil out of the flowers that we put in the ear, and it does a couple of things. If you make mullein flower oils by steeping the flowers in like olive oil, you do that for about a month, and you can blenderize it right before you press it out if you want, and filter it out. You get this mullein flower oil, and you can warm it up and put it in the ear when someone has an earache, and it does a couple of things. One is the anti-inflammatory effect of the mullein tends to reduce the inflammation, but the warmth of the oil tends to dilate the blood vessels in the area. And one of the things that causes pain in an earache is the pressure. So when you dilate the tissues with the warmth, the pressure goes down. And you tend to get a little bit of reabsorption of fluids that are trapped in there. So warm mullein flower in the oil is anti-inflammatory, plus the warmth helps reduce the discomfort. Mullein was brought to this country as a fish poison. And that's because when the flowers, when the seeds ripen in the stalk, a neurotoxin called rotenone forms in the seeds. And so you can actually, I don't recommend that you do this, but you can dam up a little stream and crush up a bunch of mullein stalks and throw it in there, and the fish will float to the surface and you can just pick them up. But it means that when you use mullein as an herb, the flower stalk, and that's why it was brought here. It was brought here in order to harvest fish from the rivers, from Europe. So when you harvest mullein flowers, you really want to make sure that you're only picking flowers, because if you lop off the tops and get a bunch of ripe seed, you're going to be putting a neurotoxin in your herbal So gentian. Gentian is considered to be the classic bitter. Anybody ever had a Manhattan or an old fashioned? Yeah. Well, you know what you put in those? You put Angostura bitters, and Angostura bitters is primarily gentian root with a bunch of sugar in it, and that's part of the older tradition of aperient cocktails, or bitters before the meal, in order to whet the appetite and stimulate digestion. So gentian is one of the classic bitters because it has very little other pharmacologic properties. So it's great for pregnant women. You know, you don't want to give pregnant women chamiso pardo, sagebrush, because all of that volatile oil and plus all that artemisinin, and we have no idea what that's going to do to baby, but the volatile oils are going to tend to have a stimulating effect on the uterus, and that's not appropriate in pregnancy. And of course, the next question is, does that make it strong enough to be an abortive? And no, it's not, but it's still not something you'd want to use in pregnancy. So that's a little mountain gentian there, Gentiana datansa. And this is a related species. This is green gentian, or monument plant, and this is a biennial. And this plant always, I think it's so cool because it looks so out of place in the forest. It looks so tropical. It's these huge, voluptuous, big leaves that look tropical, yet it's here in our dry forests of New Mexico. And I've dug up green gentians that have roots this big around and 4 feet long. So it's a really robust plant. And so this is the first year, and this is the second year, and that plant, there's a nice little Arnica hiding there on the right. That plant is about 7 feet tall. So we use primarily the root of the green gentian. I don't use it a lot because it's bitter, but it's just not bitter enough. Where do the gentians grow? Well, if you drive up to Valle Escondido, you know where that is? There's lots of them there on the way up to Garcia Park. So they grow mountainous, probably above 7,500 feet, and I've seen them growing up to 8,500 feet. They prefer places that trap some moisture, so they prefer north sides or meadows. I'll see them in where water will get trapped.
So where do you?
You know, I don't go up to Williams that much because I can't pick herbs and hike at the same time. I have to go where I can drive and get off the road, so I don't know if they're at Williams Lake or not. Do you know, John? Yes. John knows, yes. The answer is yes. Horehound. So this is another Laminaceae in the what people, mistakenly call the mint family. So horehound is another bitter, and this is another interesting aspect to bitter, and what I described initially about that whole parasympathetic response is, there's very little that we can find in horehound that would account for it being an expectorant, yet it's one of these old-timey remedies to help loosen a cough. There's horehound cough drops, and so really it seems like what explains the mechanism of action of horehound as an expectorant is the bitterness, because we get through that bitter taste, we get some perspiration, but we may get some enhanced secretion into the lungs too. It's a head scratcher. There's a lot of head scratchers in herbs. I mean, this stuff that we learn new all the time. When we get around to mullein, we'll talk about one. Yes?
Introduce.
Isn't it? Yeah, I think horehound's an introduced plant. Yeah.
It's invasive.
Yes, it's an invasive weed, unlike Europeans in North America. So plantain, this is an interesting little plant that is the first one I'll talk about, maybe the only one I'll talk about as a demulcent. And a demulcent is kind of, sort of the opposite of an astringent. Demulcents have slippery mucus-like proteins in them that soothe and coat mucous membranes inside, and they can also be used on the exterior skin to create a kind of soothing coating on the skin there too. So we use demulcents in a variety of places, so let's talk about diarrhea again. One of the first things in herbal medicine we might try would be an astringent, and if the body doesn't respond to that, because sometimes the gut is so inflamed that an astringent really won't reduce the inflammation. And in that case, we go, well, let's try being nice to it and giving it something soothing and slippery. And so often you can use a demulcent like plantain to coat the surface of the gut to help treat diarrhea. It also is, demulcents are useful for dry, sore throats and any dry tissue that you can think of. Another interesting thing about plantain is it has an enzyme in it, a protein lysing enzyme that makes it useful as a first aid for venomous insect stings. So if you're stung by a bee or a wasp and you happen to be near some plantain, you can pick up a leaf and chew it up and apply it to the sting, and it'll break down a significant amount of the protein in the venom and reduce your reaction to it. Where do you find that? Oh, well, people are trying to poison it out of their lawns all the time. It grows near almost any waterway. It's common up against houses and in yards. It's really common. I mean, it's everywhere.
Could you use it
On a dog?
Yeah, dog.
You could try that, although I would probably go with the astringent first. Yeah, astringents are always what I'd use first. Yes? From around where? Oh, did you? Uh-huh. And you transplanted them? Really? You're one of the few people who wants plantain. People with lawns will hate you. So nettles is a really interesting plant. This is an example of one of those plants that, all of these plants, of course, have been familiars to humans for a long time, and we use them for all kinds of things, and they were our first medicines. But, nowhere in the documented literature until about 15 years ago was nettle ever used for treating allergies. There's just nothing documented about it. But nettles does have some properties which makes it, it's both a urinary tract astringent and a urinary tract acidifier, which makes it quite useful in urinary tract infections. And they did a real double-blind study with nettles up at a university in Oregon. And one of the side effects reported was a lessening of allergy symptoms. And so here, after, millennia of using nettles, eating nettles as food, it's great food, suddenly in 1989, 1995, somewhere in there, we go, wow, nettles helps people with allergies. So it's like, here's this plant that's been around all this time, and suddenly we discover it's useful for allergies. So, but mostly we think about nettles as a food, number one. Nettles has as much protein as meat.
Bull nettle?
No, bull nettle is an aster family plant. That's a thistle, and this is Urtica dioica. It's Urticaceae. And as far as I know, it's the only species of Urtica in North America. But no, so it's a different plant. It's called stinging nettles, and the reason it's called stinging nettles is because it has tiny little hairs all over it that are tubular, and if you touch those hairs, it drains a little bit of formic acid on your skin and burns you. There's some reports, too, that nettles actually contains histamine, but I don't know if that's actually true. There's been some argument about that, but it would be really interesting interesting because not only are you irritating the skin, but you're adding extra histamine to it to ramp up the reaction. So nettles also contain an acid that is astringent called phosphoric acid, and that phosphoric acid is really the principle behind why it's useful as a urinary tract astringent, but it also pretty effectively lowers pH of the urine, makes the urine more acid. Now, about 70% of the bladder infections that human beings get are caused by bacteria that prefer an alkaline environment. And so if you can acidify the urine, you not only make the environment inhospitable pH-wise, but you also get the added effect of the astringency. The phosphoric acid in it, though, is phosphorus. It's fertilizer. So people will also take nettles and chop them up and throw them in a bucket and rot them for a few days and pour it on their plants because of the presence of the phosphorus in it. And like I say, it's really great food. You know, you can actually eat it raw off the plant. If you pull a leaf off and you smush it, you destroy most of the formic acid and that stinging effect, and you can just eat it right off the plant that way. If you're going to collect a lot of it for food, though, you want to get it before it does this, before it's beginning to seed, because it's getting pretty coarse and hairy and not very much fun to chew at this point. It's better to get it earlier in the spring, probably here in the next few weeks.
So
Good thing you brought that up. Yes, so the leaves are what are eaten. The leaves are what we make tea out of as a urinary tract astringent. But it's interesting because the root has an aromatase inhibitor in it, and it helps interfere with the conversion of testosterone into dihydrotestosterone. And dihydrotestosterone is not only what triggers the male pattern baldness, it causes follicles to turn off hair growth. So I'm not really making a case for it treating baldness, but the more important thing is that it's dihydrotestosterone that causes benign prostatic hypertrophy, the swelling of the prostate that so many men get. And so if you can interfere with the conversion of testosterone to dihydrotestosterone, you can effectively treat benign prostatic hypertrophy. Yes, Bob?
What's the mechanism?
We have no idea why nettles treats allergies yet. I've not seen any science on it at all. But they first noticed it there as a side effect reported, and we all kind of went, hey, that's pretty cool. So now, fresh nettles extract I sell in the summer almost more than any other extract because of people using it for allergies. Don't know why. Just pollen allergies. Pollen. Yeah, seasonal type allergies. Symptomatic treatment. Another nettle's a little further along in seed, betony. And so this is Scropherilaceae, as was the mullein. Remember the mullein? I didn't mention that. The figwort family. And this is pedicularis, and we call it betony, not to be confused with the Stachys genus of European wood betony that's a Laminaceae. But the betonies are really interesting plants because they have the effect of being antispasmodic on smooth muscle tissue. And they have some effect on striated muscle too. So what that all means is smooth muscle, we have different kinds of muscle in our body. Smooth muscle is what blood vessels are lined with. The uterus is smooth muscle. The intestines are smooth muscle. Striated muscle is skeletal muscle. And so there's a lot of herbs that relax smooth muscle like valerian does, but it doesn't do anything for striated muscle. But betony works both for smooth and striated muscle and with sedation. So this is something that relaxes muscle and helps put you to sleep, calm you down. Now, betony is kind of a saprophyte, so you have to be careful when you pick it to make sure it's not growing on anything adjacent that might be toxic. So it can incorporate itself into the roots of other plants and take on some of their chemical characteristics. So you wouldn't want to be, picking it next to delphiniums or something like that. So this one's Pedicularis perii. Yes, was there a question? Yes. Actually, this one is diverging from many of my simple principles. I did do that just to, throw you a little bit. This is called elephant's head betony, or Pedicularis groenlandica, and it's equally useful and much prettier. Blue vervain. So this is in the verbena family, Verbenaceae, and we have a number of species of this. I actually kind of prefer the little prostrate ones. I think they're more potent than this more noticeable upright Verbena macdougalli. But the vervains have a number of principles. They are also sedative, and they are also antifebrile. They tend to lower fever, they tend to be calming, and they're very bitter. But what I like to use blue vervain for, I keep feeling like I'm knocking this thing. People hear it going clickety-click. I like to use it for children that are febrile because it helps lower fever and calm them down. And, this is interesting. Before Western medicine, what it is now, back in the late 1800s, we had a variety of schools of thought in medicine. Homeopathy actually built a lot of the hospitals and medical colleges in the United States long before what we consider to be AMA medicine really was dominant. But there was a class of physicians called the eclectics, and one of the principles that they liked to look at in a sick person was whether their response to disease was sthenic or asthenic. And sthenic is strong, and asthenic is not strong or weak. And so when you see a child who has a hypersthenic response to fever, meaning one of those kids that starts getting sick and they start to bounce off the walls and they get nuts and crazy and cranky and irritable, that's a hypersthenic response according to the eclectics evaluation. And so blue vervain is really great for that because it calms the kids down, it helps lower their fever. And because it's so bitter, the best way to give it to kids is what we in herbal medicine call an electuary. And an electuary is where you would boil the tea and then you put it in a double boiler and you boil off most of the water until you get a thickened extract of the plant, and then you mix it with jelly or honey or maple syrup to make it taste good. And that way you can get a significant dose into a kid despite its bitterness. Just another picture of MacDougall there. No kilt. Oh, was that the end? Oh, no, there we go. I got a blank spot. I wonder about that. So this is a borage family plant. This is hound's tongue, and in Spanish we call it lengua de vaca. Both of those names come from the fact that in the fall, the first-year plant produces, the leaves they're rather tongue-shaped, and as the names imply, and they turn red, and they look like a cow's tongue or a dog's tongue. So lengua de vaca is cow's tongue in Spanish, and hound's tongue, of course, is English for hound's tongue. So this plant is interesting because its most close relative that we're familiar with in herbal medicine is comfrey. And comfrey is demulcent, so it's useful as a demulcent. But the other really significant thing about comfrey and hound's tongue is they contain a substance called allantoin. And allantoin is a cell metabolite that actually accelerates the division rate of cells. So, in the early 1900s, it would be easy to go into a drugstore and find a salve that contained comfrey or hound's tongue or just purified allantoin for wounds to heal them more quickly. But this, like a lot of other herbal medicines, has been sort of, shoved aside in favor of other things that are more profitable. So one can use especially the root. The root is where the allantoin is concentrated, but the leaves contain it also, for making salves for healing wounds. Or you could make a mouth rinse for post-oral surgery, as long as you're allowed to rinse. And An interesting thing about these plants, that they, like a number of plants, have some of a group of substances called pyrrolizidine alkaloids. Pyrrolizidine alkaloids, some of them are extremely toxic. The best plants we have around in here that have toxic pyrrolizidine alkaloids are called senecios. And the deal is, though, there are lots of different ones, and they're not all toxic. So because the FDA is aware that there are pyrrolizidine alkaloids in comfrey and in hound's tongue, and because some pyrrolizidine alkaloids are toxic, they don't allow us to sell this for internal use because of their concern about it. In truth, the pyrrolizidine alkaloids in comfrey and hound's tongues are not toxic. But I always like to let people know that, because people go, oh, well, that has pyrrolizidine alkaloids, you can't consume that. Well, there's a lot of different pyrrolizidine alkaloids, they're not all toxic. Arnica. So Arnica is the counter-irritant. So what does that mean? Counter-irritant. So that must mean that you first have an irritation and then you counter-irritate it, right? And that's exactly what it means. So if you are on your way to the bathroom in the middle of the night and you slam your leg into the coffee table, because like me, you don't have your glasses on, and you get a big bruise, you've gotten an initial insult, an initial irritation, a bruise, and little capillary blood vessels have been crushed and their blood weeps out and into the tissue around it and creates this black and blue thing. And so if you apply something which slightly angers the skin, it causes the little blood vessels in the skin to dilate. Another name for this, actually, another old pharmacy name is rubefacient, something which makes the face red or the skin red. So arnica irritates the skin, and when it does that in dilating those blood vessels, it increases their surface area and causes them to absorb fluids escaped into that area more quickly, and it will help reduce the edema of a swollen ankle, swollen elbow. It will help remove the bruising much more rapidly, because that blood is now, it's no longer part of the organized structure of the body. It's escaped into what we call interstitial space, and the body can't get it out very quickly. So by increasing the circulation in that area, you can remove the bruising more quickly, you can reduce the swelling, and even though swelling is part of the body's response, once the swelling sets in, it actually creates an area of high barometric pressure. The pressure in that area is, and it keeps healing out of the area. So if you can reduce the swelling, you can speed healing by allowing circulation to move into the tissue. Oh my. Kind of got off my simple principles, didn't I? Sorry. This is Clematis, which is a buttercup family, Ranunculaceae. This one's Clematis ligusticafolia, or narrow-leaf clematis. Grows all along the streams here. And Clematis, like Arnica, is also a counter-irritant. You can, and one of my favorite ways to use it is to just take, you can roll up it's a vine, and it'll grow with tendrils that are 30, 40 feet long, and you just kind of roll them up like you would a cowboy rope and take them home, pull all the leaves off, stick them in a blender with alcohol and puree it, and make a pretty good liniment for bruising and sore joints and such. No, I would use the leaves and the tendrils and leave the woody stem behind. Throw it on the compost heap. Give it to your grandchildren to play with. The other really interesting thing about Clematis, though, is that it seems to have a cerebrovasodilating effect. It dilates, cerebrovasconstricting effect. And so it is useful for some people that have migraine headaches. It doesn't work for everybody, but for, migraines are really hard to treat, whether you're in regular medicine or any other thing. They're triggered by so many different things, and not thing seems to work for everybody. But for those that Clematis works for, it's very gratifying to recommend. And so in that case, what I would do is use the tincture of clematis. And you can use the same tincture that you would use as a liniment, but you would use internal doses of, 15, 20 drops in a glass of water. Another demulcent. This is a mallow family plant. All of the mallows are demulcents. And matter of fact, the archetypal mallow, marshmallow, that's where marshmallows came from first. And of course, what we did is took the roots and boiled them, and they have a significant amount of carbohydrate in them too, sweetness in them. So you boil the roots, and the scum that comes to the surface of the pot, you scrape off and you can spread it on sheets. Those were the first marshmallows. So that slippery protein, which tends to coagulate when you boil it, is present in most of the mallows in some form or another and makes them useful demulcents. Now, this particular plant you could use as a demulcent, but around here what it's famous for is for the hair. If you make a tea of this plant, Yerba del Negro, or there's another little shorter species, Sphaeralceae coccinea, that they call Yerba de la Negrita, diminutive of the plant. This is not, well, actually, this is interesting enough. This is the best story I've got. I don't know if it's true, but supposedly this plant, the Spanish named this plant because during the Civil War, there was a black man in New Mexico who was sticking it in his shoes to protect his blisters from the sides of his shoes, and they called it Herb of the Black Guy, Yerba del Negro. And so the little plant is called Yerba de la Negrita, not because his daughter was doing it too, but just because it's diminutive of the plant, So, so what you can do is make a tea of Yerba del Negro or Yerba de la Negrita and filter it out. And if after you wash your hair, you rinse it through your hair, as it dries, those proteins shrink like proteins do when they dry. Like a hide will curl up when it dries, like an egg. If you've ever dropped a blob of egg white on your counter, you come back later and it's gone like this. Well, those proteins shrink. So if you let this dry in your hair, what it does is add wave to your hair. And it can make your hair a little curly. So it has the reputation of making hair grow where hair don't grow, like on bald guys' heads. And it's a traditional remedy for use in that way. And who knows, I bought the original company from the man who invented the first Yerba de la Negrita shampoo product. It was a man named Al Lopez, who lived up in Las Trampas, New Mexico. And we get a lot of people who feel like it really makes hair grow. We have a cancer center in California that buys it for their patients. So I don't really know that it does. It would be ingenuine of me to claim that. But so that's Yerba del Negro or Yerba de la Negrita. And this is prickly poppy in the papaver family, and in Spanish we call it cardo santo. And this has weak opiates in it, but they're present in greater quantities than other plants that have weak opiates, like lettuce. And so it's somewhat more useful. It isn't strong enough to really be an effective pain management plant, but it is strong enough to help people fall asleep. And so you can either use the chopped dried plant or you can make a fresh extract of the foliage. Oh, that's it. I'm out of slides. Any questions? Yes. Cardo santo? I would imagine you need to stratify it and let the seeds freeze. They're kind of round and they're going to fall on the ground and roll around, and they don't have any mechanism to really get themselves wedged in there, so they're going to be vulnerable to lots of freezing temperatures. So I would say freeze them, stratify them in soil, and put them in the freezer. Yes, sir.
I have a question, Doc, about the bitter. So the taste of bitter on the tongue causes a mild stimulation of the vagus nerve. Now, is it the taste receptor to the brain, and that is what causes the stimulation? Or is any of the material entering the bloodstream via the tongue, or both?
I don't know that it's actually has to do with some pharmacologic effect of the drug entering the bloodstream and causing the effect. My understanding is that it's just simply a response to the taste. Well, and that's it for, you know, and there are companies that actually make bitters in capsules, and most herbalists are like, it's like, I mean, I guess you got taste receptors in your gut, but, I mean, not that I know of. Bob, you had something to say? Oh, I think you weren't making noises over here? Okay.
How do you deal with different potencies and herbs? You know, you mentioned that some have some patches of some of the plants are different from other patches genetically, or on different soils, or even different seasonal things. You know, less water some years and such. But all the variations in the potency of the you know, plant chemistry. How do you deal with that?
We just use more or less.
Okay.
You know, you try out a batch and see how it is. You know, plants, there's such a broad, for most plants. Now, I mean, of course, there's some plants that are extremely toxic or extremely potent, and you have to be very careful about the dose, you know. And some plants that we use medicinally are like that. Pulsatilla is like that, and there's a few other plants. But for the most part, it's really difficult to make somebody sick or very sick with too much of a plant. You know, interesting example of that is that in 2013, you know, we have this thing, my company's regulated by the Food and Drug Administration, so I have to do all the same things to manufacture my herbal products as drug companies do to manufacture theirs. So we have to report adverse events, and adverse events is when somebody is hospitalized or dies from a device or a drug or a plant or whatever. In 2013, all of the adverse events associated with every natural product, all of the herbs, all the supplements, and there's some sleazy stuff out there. I mean, there's some goofballs making some crappy herbal stuff that's actually toxic, but all of the adverse events for the whole natural products industry made up less than 0.5% of the adverse events associated with Tylenol. So and the reason I point that out is not to demonize Tylenol or Western medicine or anything, but is to say plants in general are very non-toxic, and we arrive at doses by just going, well, you know, if it's not working, let's try more. You know, and well, we tried more and we'll try more, and if it doesn't work, well, maybe we should try a different plant. Or maybe you should see your doctor and find out what's really going on, and then you can either take his medicine or come back and we'll give you something different. Or her medicine. Bob?
There's an interesting comparison of allopathic medicines and plant medicines. Comfrey was, because of pyrazolidine alkaloid, was said to have caused probably one death. One. Ibuprofen causes annually 20,000, and it's over the counter.
Right. Right, and the one death that was suspected with comfrey was in a person who already had compromised liver function. Because the problem with pyrazolidine alkaloids is they become cascadingly toxic. Every time the body tries to detoxify them, they become more toxic.
But the one death still caused it to be restricted and not be able to take it for anybody at any time, orally. One death.
Right, it seems kind of like a waste of the FDA's time, but go figure. Yes?
Isn't the comfrey used for bone setting as an external?
Well, comfrey does have a reputation for setting bones, and that is a common practice to use a poultice on a broken bone. And for my life, I don't understand how that might work. But there's a lot of things that are done in herbal medicine, and maybe we'll discover the pharmacy behind it at some point. Maybe a big chunk of it is because it's in support of tradition and belief. And I really, again, I can't tell you how important I think think, what people believe about their medical care, how important it is. You know, it's almost more important than the drugs or the mechanisms of treatment itself. And I just think that's something that Western medicine really misses, is what's important to the patient. Well, and we call it the placebo effect, and that's kind of a denigration of the kind of healing you get when you believe in what you're doing. You know, it's really kind of chalked up to, well, you're kind of a head case, and a certain percentage of these people are going to respond paradoxically because, you know, it's biology, go figure. You know, but the truth is some people get results because they believe they're going to get results. There's something there, you know, more than me being a head case.
A lot of these where you need root that's the effective part of the plant. That's not really sustainable harvesting, is it? How do you, or some people who may, go out and clear a whole field of ocean?
Right, so I don't pick you're right. You know, I think there's enough OSHA here that if any person needs to go get themselves a couple of roots for the winter, there's enough probably to sustain that, at least with the way our population is now. For somebody like me who buys or digs 400 or 500 pounds a year, the way I have to do it is I have to go to places, around here our OSHA is very small. There are places in the San Juan Mountains where there will be 100 stalks of Osha coming out, and it forms a rhizome. So you can go through and you can cut out a third of a plant or a half of a plant and get 4 or 5 pounds of fresh root, and you don't kill the plant. And I've gone back to those same plants 4 or 5 years later, and they've repopulated themselves back into the soil. So it can be sustainably harvested if you're careful, but unfortunately it's one of those plants that's growing in popularity, and there has always been, the reason golden seal and ginseng were knocked nearly to extinction was because during the Depression, the hill people of Appalachia, they could sell it. Those were drugs back then. Golden seal, hydrastis, was a drug back then, and they dug it all out trying to feed their families. So herb pickers tend to be an itinerant, poor lot, and they're not always as careful as we'd like them to be. I try to be very careful with mine. I won't buy plants from people that I don't trust how they're picking, and I pick a lot of my own plants for that reason. Interesting thing about golden seal, do you remember murine eye drops? Do you remember when the bottle was yellow? Yeah? Well, because hydrastine, golden seal used to be the active ingredient in murine. That made it yellow. Originally, it was a clear bottle with a yellow solution in it, and then when the FDA said, there was a time at which they said, we're going to grandfather in a bunch of these old remedies like Lydia Pinkhams and stuff, and the rest of this stuff, you're going to have to do the research to show that it's worth something or quit selling it. So the murine quit putting golden seal in their eye drops, and they used tetrahydrozoline, and they put it in a yellow plastic bottle to have that identity continuity.
Any more questions for Rob?
What are some of the herb plants that you recommend for parasite fencing?
Depends upon the parasite. For for small intestinal worms, black walnut is one of my favorite, and I like to mix it with wormwood. But I believe that healthy people probably always have some parasites. You can't have a sterile GI tract. We're learning more and more about that these days, even in Western medicine, how important the biome of the gut is. And I doubt that anybody is 100% free of parasites, and we live symbiotically with them, It's when they grow out of control that it's a problem, and you can knock those populations back of certain parasites with herbs pretty effectively.
Wormwood is Artemisia's in accent, and what's this?
Well, as a general rule, the genus of Artemisia is referred to in lay terms as the wormwoods.
Right.
And it's because of the presence of artemisin in the wormwoods that irritates parasites in the gut and makes them want to find a way out. And in some cases, strong enough to, solutions of it can be somewhat toxic and deadly to them, but it's not it doesn't have the level of parasiticide that is just going to sterilize your gut of those species.
Or rot your brain. I mean, isn't absinthe was prohibited for a while and now it's allowed?
Yeah, you know, that's been fairly disproven that absinthe was as toxic or causing the mental illness that they thought it was. Really, it was just alcoholism.
Well, thank you, Rob.
Glad to, thank you.